October 28, 1943. The Bismarck Sea stretched endlessly beneath Captain William Wild Bill Henderson's B-25 Mitchell bomber as he banked hard left, defying every order he'd received that morning. At 800 feet above the churning Pacific waters, he could see the muzzle flashes from the Japanese destroyer escorts below, their 25-millimeter guns stitching deadly lines of tracer fire across his intended flight path. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Jimmy Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas, gripped his controls and shouted over the engine noise, "Bill, we're supposed to stay at 3,000 feet." But Henderson had already made his choice. Through the plexiglass nose of his aircraft, he could see the massive Japanese convoy spread across 12 square miles of ocean, oil tankers, troop transports, and supply ships that could keep the enemy war machine grinding forward for months. Standard bombing altitude meant missing 90% of their targets. Low-level strafing meant almost certain death. Henderson pushed the stick forward anyway, diving toward the wave tops at 280 miles per hour, his twin Wright R-2600 engines screaming in protest. Behind him, 8 more B-25s followed in formation, their crews trusting their squadron leader's instincts over headquarters' battle plan. The smell of cordite and aviation fuel filled Henderson's nostrils as he lined up his first target, a 10,000-ton tanker that would explode like a miniature sun if his improvised attack pattern worked. No one in the 5th Air Force knew that one pilot's disobedience that morning would revolutionize Pacific theater combat tactics and turn American medium bombers into the most feared ship killers in naval aviation history. William Henderson had grown up fixing farm equipment in rural Nebraska, where his father ran a small repair shop that served wheat farmers across 3 counties. Born in 1917, he learned to troubleshoot mechanical problems by necessity. When a harvester broke down during wheat season, there was no time to wait for factory parts or official repair manuals. You improvised, you adapted, and you made things work with whatever materials you had on hand. His mother, a schoolteacher, insisted he finish high school despite the family's financial struggles during the Great Depression, and his younger sister, Mary, often found him in the barn after supper, sketching modifications to engines and dreaming of machines that could fly. When Henderson enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, his mechanical aptitude caught the attention of flight instructors who noted his unusual ability to coax maximum performance from temperamental training aircraft. During basic flight training at Randolph Field in Texas, he earned a reputation for landing damaged planes that other cadets would have abandoned, using techniques he improvised on the spot. His instructor, Major Robert Hayes, wrote in Henderson's evaluation, "This cadet demonstrates exceptional mechanical intuition and tactical adaptability. He thinks 3 steps ahead of his aircraft." Fellow cadets initially viewed Henderson's unconventional approaches with suspicion. He modified his flight patterns during training exercises, adjusted engine settings beyond recommended parameters, and often achieved better results than pilots who followed procedures exactly. But when Henderson consistently outperformed his classmates in gunnery practice and navigation exercises, earning the highest marks in his graduating class, even the skeptics began paying attention to his methods. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between Allied supply lines and the expanding Japanese Empire. By late 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical phase, where control of shipping lanes would determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The Japanese Empire depended on a vast network of cargo vessels, tankers, and troop transports to supply their garrisons, scattered across thousands of islands from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. Every month, hundreds of Japanese ships moved essential supplies, fuel oil, ammunition, reinforcements, and medical equipment, along routes that stretched across 10,000 miles of ocean. American submarines had achieved remarkable success against this maritime lifeline, sinking over 1 million tons of Japanese shipping in the first 10 months of 1943 alone. But submarine warfare was a slow, methodical process that couldn't respond quickly to intelligence reports about specific convoys. The U.S. Navy desperately needed a way to attack Japanese shipping with immediate, overwhelming force when reconnaissance flights located high-value targets. Traditional high-altitude bombing had proven woefully inadequate against moving ships. Even the most experienced bombardiers achieved hit rates below 15% when attacking vessels from 20,000 feet. And Japanese escort ships had become increasingly effective at providing anti-aircraft cover for their convoys. Meanwhile, Japanese naval commanders had grown confident that their supply runs were relatively safe from air attack as long as they maintained strong fighter escort and sailed during daylight hours, when American bombers could be spotted and intercepted miles away. The mathematical reality was stark. At current loss rates, Japanese merchant shipping could sustain the war effort for another 2 years, while American forces desperately needed to accelerate their island-hopping campaign before enemy defenses became insurmountable. Henderson's squadron, the 312th Bombardment Group, had been tasked with attacking Japanese shipping using conventional medium-altitude bombing techniques, but after 6 months of missions with minimal results, morale was deteriorating, and Allied commanders were questioning whether air power could significantly impact the enemy's maritime supply network. The morning of October 28th began with Henderson studying intelligence photographs that revealed the largest Japanese convoy spotted in the Southwest Pacific since the Battle of Midway. 17 ships traveling in formation, 4 massive tankers carrying aviation fuel, 6 troop transports loaded with reinforcements for Japanese garrisons in the Philippines, 3 ammunition ships, and 4 destroyer escorts providing anti-aircraft protection. The convoy was moving northwest at 12 knots, maintaining a defensive formation that kept the most valuable vessels in the center, surrounded by overlapping fields of defensive fire. Standard 5th Air Force doctrine called for medium bombers to attack from 3,000 feet in level flight, dropping general-purpose bombs while staying above the effective range of light anti-aircraft weapons. This approach had worked reasonably well against stationary targets like airfields and supply depots. But Henderson had watched too many missions where the majority of bombs fell harmlessly into the ocean, while Japanese ships continued their journeys unharmed. During the pre-flight briefing, Major Collins outlined the day's mission parameters. 9 B-25s would approach the convoy from the southeast, maintain formation integrity, execute bombing runs from 3,000 feet, and return to base after expending their ordnance. Remember, Collins emphasized, tapping the tactical diagram with his pointer, these destroyer escorts carry significant anti-aircraft firepower. Stay above 3,000 feet, and you'll be outside their effective engagement envelope. Henderson raised his hand and asked, "Sir, what if we went in low and fast? Skip bombing techniques, work against ships." Collins shook his head firmly. "Negative, Captain. Low-level attacks are suicide against a convoy this size. You'd be flying through a wall of flak with no room to maneuver." The other pilots nodded agreement. Everyone had heard stories of B-25s shot down during low-level attacks, their crews killed when armor-piercing rounds from destroyer escorts tore through aluminum fuselages like tissue paper. But Henderson had been thinking about a different approach, one that combined the surprise element of low-level attack with modifications he'd been experimenting with during maintenance periods. His crew chief, Sergeant Mike O'Connor from Boston, had helped Henderson install additional forward-firing machine guns in his B-25's nose section, creating a concentration of firepower that could suppress anti-aircraft gunners while the bomber approached its target. The modification wasn't officially approved, but it wasn't explicitly forbidden either, and Henderson believed that concentrated machine gun fire could clear the decks of enemy ships long enough for accurate bomb placement. He thought it was over, but destiny wasn't done with him yet. As Henderson's formation approached the Japanese convoy, flying in perfect textbook formation at 3,000 feet, the morning sun glinted off the Pacific swells in a way that reminded him of wheat fields back home during harvest season. The radio crackled with routine position reports and navigation updates, but Henderson's attention focused on the geometric arrangement of ships below. The convoy had organized itself into a defensive box formation, with the 4 destroyer escorts positioned at the corners to provide maximum anti-aircraft coverage. From his current altitude, Henderson could see the systematic way Japanese gunners were tracking his formation, their weapons traversing smoothly to maintain firing solutions on the approaching bombers. The first barrage of anti-aircraft fire began at precisely the moment Henderson's formation reached the convoy's outer defensive perimeter, black puffs of explosive shells bursting at 3,000 feet with mathematical precision. "Jesus Christ!" muttered Rodriguez, watching the flak pattern intensify. "They've got our altitude zeroed perfectly." Henderson watched his lead bombardier, Lieutenant Tony Marconi from Newark, New Jersey, adjust his Norden bomb sight and prepare for the bombing run. But something was wrong with the tactical picture. The Japanese ships were executing synchronized evasive maneuvers, turning in coordinated patterns that would make accurate bombing from altitude nearly impossible. The convoy commander had obviously studied American bomber tactics and developed countermeasures specifically designed to defeat medium-altitude attacks. Henderson realized that following standard procedures would result in another mission where the majority of bombs missed their targets, allowing this crucial enemy convoy to continue its journey and deliver supplies that would cost American lives in future battles. He made his decision in the span of 3 heartbeats, breaking radio silence to announce, "Blue Squadron, this is Blue Leader. Follow me down to the deck. We're going in low and fast." Major Collins' voice erupted over the radio immediately. "Henderson, maintain altitude. That's a direct order." But Henderson had already pushed his stick forward, diving toward the wave tops at full throttle, his engines roaring as he accelerated past 300 miles per hour. Behind him, 8 other B-25s followed in formation, their pilots choosing to trust Henderson's tactical judgment over headquarters' operational plan. The mathematical reality of their situation was brutal. At high altitude, they would achieve perhaps 2 hits out of 36 bombs dropped, barely inconveniencing the enemy convoy. At wavetop level, they might all die, but they might also destroy every ship in the formation. And then, silence, until the next order came through. Henderson's B-25 screamed across the Pacific at masthead height, so low that spray from the ocean swells spattered against his windscreen, and the roar of his engines echoed off the water like rolling thunder. At this altitude, the Japanese destroyer escorts couldn't depress their main anti-aircraft guns low enough to track his approach. But Henderson knew he had perhaps 30 seconds before the enemy gunners adjusted their tactics and brought lighter weapons to bear. Through his intercom, he could hear Sergeant Bill Murphy, his top turret gunner from Detroit, counting down the distance to their first target. 800 yards, 700 yards. "Jesus, Bill, I can see their faces." The lead tanker, a massive vessel displacing approximately 12,000 tons, grew larger in Henderson's windscreen with each passing second. This ship alone carried enough aviation fuel to support Japanese fighter operations for 6 weeks, and Henderson had decided to attack it using a technique he'd developed during training exercises, but never tested in actual combat. Instead of dropping his bombs from above and hoping for accuracy, Henderson planned to release his ordnance at the precise moment his aircraft passed alongside the tanker's hull, allowing the bombs to skip across the water surface like stones and detonate against the ship's waterline below the armor belt. This skip bombing technique required perfect timing and steady nerves. Released too early, and the bombs would explode harmlessly in the ocean too late, and Henderson's aircraft would be destroyed by its own ordnance. Rodriguez gripped his controls and shouted, "Bill, the flak's getting heavier!" indeed. The Japanese gunners had recovered from their initial surprise and were now filling the air around Henderson's formation with a deadly crossfire of 25mm explosive shells and machine gun rounds. Henderson could hear metal fragments striking his aircraft's aluminum skin, and his left engine began running roughly after taking damage from flying debris. But the modified nose armament that Sergeant O'Connor had installed was proving its worth. 850 caliber machine guns concentrated in the B-25's nose section were laying down a devastating curtain of fire that swept the tanker's decks clear of anti-aircraft gunners and forced Japanese sailors to take cover behind steel bulkheads. The psychological effect was immediate and overwhelming. Japanese crews had never experienced such concentrated firepower from a single aircraft, and the sound of hundreds of armor-piercing rounds striking their ship's superstructure created panic that disrupted their defensive coordination. At 200 yards from the tanker, Henderson could see individual details with startling clarity: oil stains on the ship's deck plates, the faces of Japanese sailors diving for cover, steam rising from the vessel's engine compartments. His bombardier, Lieutenant Marconi, had adjusted his bomb release calculations for the unprecedented attack profile, and Henderson felt the aircraft lurch slightly as 2,000 pounds of high explosives dropped from the bomb bay. The first bomb struck the water 50 feet from the tanker's hull and skipped twice before exploding against the ship's waterline with a flash of orange flame that temporarily blinded everyone within half a mile. The second bomb penetrated the tanker's hull 3 feet below the surface, detonating inside a fuel storage compartment and triggering a secondary explosion that lifted the ship's forward section 20 feet out of the water. Henderson pulled his B-25 into a climbing turn, clearing the tanker's superstructure by less than 30 feet as burning aviation fuel spread across several acres of ocean surface. Behind him, the other aircraft in his formation were executing similar attacks against their assigned targets, and Henderson watched through his rear-facing windows as Lieutenant Pete Johnson from Oklahoma City lined up his approach on one of the troop transports. Johnson's aircraft took heavy damage from defensive fire, with one engine trailing black smoke and his left wing shredded by flak fragments, but he maintained his attack profile until his bombs struck home, punching massive holes in the transport's hull and sending the vessel listing to starboard. The cascade effect Henderson had hoped for was beginning. The convoy's defensive formation was breaking apart as individual ships maneuvered independently to avoid the burning oil slick from the destroyed tanker, while Japanese anti-aircraft gunners found themselves unable to coordinate their fire against targets attacking from multiple directions at wave-top altitude. Henderson banked hard right and lined up his second attack run, this time targeting one of the ammunition ships that could be identified by the special handling equipment visible on its deck. The mathematics of victory were written in those next 60 seconds as Henderson's improvised tactics transformed his squadron from a conventional bombing unit into the most effective ship-killing force in the Pacific theater. The ammunition ship erupted like a volcano when Henderson's second bombing run found its target, the explosion so violent that the shock wave knocked his B-25 sideways and cracked his windscreen. The blast vaporized everything within a 300-yard radius, sending fragments of steel plating spinning through the air like deadly confetti and triggering sympathetic explosions on 2 nearby vessels. Henderson fought to maintain control of his aircraft as debris rained down around him, and he could hear Rodriguez praying in Spanish over the intercom, while Sergeant Murphy reported damage to their starboard wing. But the tactical picture was developing exactly as Henderson had envisioned. The Japanese convoy was no longer an organized defensive formation, but rather a collection of individual ships struggling to survive while under coordinated attack from an enemy they couldn't effectively engage. The destroyer escorts, designed to provide anti-aircraft protection against high-altitude bombers, found their weapon systems useless against targets approaching at masthead height. Their main batteries couldn't depress low enough, Their fire control systems couldn't track targets moving at 300 miles per hour across the wavetops, and their crews were psychologically unprepared for the intensity of concentrated machine gun fire that preceded each bombing attack. Henderson watched through his side window as Lieutenant Sarah Chen from San Francisco, one of only 3 female pilots in the 312th Bombardment Group, brought her B-25 down to 50 feet above the ocean and opened fire on the Convoy's command ship. Chen had been Henderson's wingman during training exercises, and she executed the low-level attack with precision that would have impressed veteran carrier pilots, her forward-firing guns silencing the command ship's bridge before her bombs struck the vessel's hull and broke its keel. The ship listed to port and began taking on water, its radio antennas tangled and smoking, effectively blinding the convoy's remaining vessels. Henderson felt a surge of pride as he realized that his tactical innovation had given ordinary bomber crews the capability to achieve results that previously required specialized attack aircraft or coordinated strikes by multiple squadrons. What they witnessed next would inspire them for decades. The final phase of Henderson's attack demonstrated the exponential effect that tactical innovation could achieve when properly executed. As the Japanese convoy struggled to maintain cohesion while under continuous assault from Henderson's formation, individual ship captains began making desperate decisions that further compromised their collective defensive capability. The remaining tanker attempted to escape by increasing speed and breaking away from the convoy's protective formation, but Lieutenant Rodriguez, Henderson's co-pilot, who had expressed concern about the unauthorized attack profile, volunteered to pursue the fleeing vessel. Henderson watched Rodriguez take the controls and dive their damaged B-25 toward the tanker's stern, ignoring the heavy anti-aircraft fire that was systematically destroying their aircraft's control surfaces. Rodriguez's attack was a masterpiece of improvised tactics. He approached the tanker from directly astern, where the vessel's defensive weapons couldn't be brought to bear, and released his remaining ordnance at point-blank range before pulling up sharply to avoid the resulting explosion. The tanker's entire aft section disintegrated in a ball of superheated flame, and the vessel's forward momentum carried it directly into the expanding fire zone, where secondary explosions consumed the ship's remaining fuel supplies. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Johnson, despite flying an aircraft that should have been declared unflyable, had somehow managed to execute 3 separate attack runs against the convoy's escort vessels, using his damaged B-25's remaining forward-firing guns to methodically destroy Japanese radar installations and communication equipment. Johnson's persistence had eliminated the convoy's ability to coordinate its defense or call for reinforcement, leaving each remaining ship to fight independently against overwhelming firepower. Sergeant Murphy, observing the battle from his turret position, later described the scene in his combat report. It was like watching dominoes fall, except each domino was a 10,000-ton warship filled with ammunition and fuel oil. The tactical transformation was complete. Henderson's decision to disobey orders and attack at wavetop level had turned 9 medium bombers into an unstoppable force that achieved destruction rates previously thought impossible for aircraft of their type. The scale of the crisis was about to become clear to Japanese naval commanders monitoring the engagement from hundreds of miles away. When the smoke cleared 47 minutes after Henderson's formation had first been detected by Japanese radar operators, 17 enemy ships had been reduced to 4 burning hulks, and 13 debris fields scattered across 25 square miles of Pacific Ocean. The largest tanker, the primary target that carried enough aviation fuel to support enemy operations for 6 weeks, had broken in half and was sinking by the stern, its cargo creating an oil slick visible from 40 miles away. 3 troop transports loaded with reinforcements intended for Japanese garrisons in the Philippines had suffered catastrophic damage that killed over 4,000 enemy soldiers and eliminated an entire infantry regiment from the Japanese order of battle. The Convoy's ammunition ship had been completely vaporized, taking with it enough artillery shells and small arms ammunition to sustain a prolonged defense of Manila. Most significantly, the 4 destroyer escorts that should have provided effective protection against air attack had been systematically disabled by concentrated machine gun fire that no one in the Japanese Navy had anticipated or prepared for. Henderson's tactical innovation had achieved a kill ratio that exceeded the performance of entire carrier task forces, using only 9 medium bombers and crews who had been trained for conventional high-altitude bombing missions. The mathematical impact was staggering. Henderson's squadron had destroyed more enemy shipping tonnage in 47 minutes than the average submarine patrol accomplished in 6 months of operations. But the true significance of the engagement extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japanese naval commanders, analyzing the wreckage and survivor reports, realized that their defensive doctrine had been fundamentally compromised by an attack profile they had never considered possible. The systematic destruction of an entire convoy by medium bombers operating at wave-top level represented a paradigm shift that would force complete revision of enemy escort procedures, convoy routing, and anti-aircraft weapon deployment. Henderson's disobedience had not only achieved devastating immediate results, but had also demonstrated a tactical capability that would influence Pacific theater operations for the remainder of the war. In that moment, Henderson understood they had to act beyond orders if they wanted to achieve victory, rather than merely following procedures that guaranteed mediocrity. The immediate aftermath of Henderson's unauthorized attack created a bureaucratic crisis that rippled through 5th Air Force headquarters and eventually reached the desk of General Douglas MacArthur himself. Major Collins, the operations officer who had explicitly ordered Henderson to maintain 3,000 feet altitude, found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining how one of his squadron leaders had achieved the most successful anti-shipping mission in Pacific theater history, while directly violating written orders. The combat reports were undeniable. Henderson's formation had destroyed 17 enemy vessels without losing a single aircraft, despite flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire at an altitude that should have guaranteed heavy casualties. But military discipline demanded consequences for insubordination, regardless of results, and Collins initially recommended court-martial proceedings against Henderson and the 8 pilots who had followed him in the unauthorized low-level attack. The investigation that followed revealed the complex dynamics that had led to Henderson's decision and the innovative modifications he had made to his aircraft's armament configuration. Sergeant O'Connor, when questioned about the unauthorized machine gun installation, explained that Henderson had personally designed the modification using components cannibalized from damaged aircraft, creating a concentration of forward-firing weaponry that exceeded factory specifications. Captain Henderson understood that standard configuration wasn't adequate for the mission requirements, O'Connor testified. He improvised a solution using available resources, just like he'd been doing since Nebraska. The investigation also uncovered Henderson's detailed analysis of previous anti-shipping missions, including mathematical calculations that demonstrated the inadequacy of conventional high-altitude bombing against moving targets. Henderson had documented hit probabilities, damage assessments, and tactical recommendations in reports that his superiors had filed without serious consideration. The evidence suggested that Henderson's disobedience was not impulsive insubordination, but rather the result of careful analysis that had identified fundamental flaws in existing doctrine. The odds revealed a truth no orders could hide. Conventional tactics were producing minimal results while enemy shipping continued to sustain Japanese war operations. 6 months after the Bismarck Sea engagement, Henderson found himself in Washington, D.C. to briefing senior Army Air Forces commanders on the tactical innovations his squadron had developed through unauthorized experimentation. The low-level strafing techniques that had emerged from Henderson's disobedience had been systematically tested, refined, and incorporated into official training programs for medium bomber crews throughout the Pacific Theater. The modified armament configuration that Sergeant O'Connor had installed was now standard equipment for B-25s, assigned to anti-shipping duties, and Henderson's attack profiles were being studied at flight schools from California to Australia. But perhaps the most significant validation of Henderson's decision came from the operational results achieved by squadrons that adopted his innovations. Anti-shipping success rates increased from 15% to 78%, while aircraft losses actually decreased due to the suppressive effect of concentrated forward-firing weaponry. Japanese naval documents captured later in the war revealed that Henderson's attack had forced enemy commanders to completely revise their convoy protection doctrine, requiring destroyers to sacrifice offensive capability in order to install additional anti-aircraft weapons specifically designed to counter low-level bombing attacks. The tactical ripple effect extended throughout the Pacific War as Japanese shipping losses accelerated dramatically once American bomber crews began employing Henderson's techniques on a systematic basis. What happened next shattered 16 years of military training protocols and official doctrine. Henderson received promotion to major and assignment as chief instructor for a new anti-shipping warfare school established in Australia, where he would train thousands of bomber crews in the tactics he had developed through innovation and disobedience. His former wingman, Lieutenant Chen, was promoted to captain and assigned to command one of the first all-female bomber squadrons in military history, using Henderson's techniques to achieve destruction rates that exceeded those of many veteran male crews. Rodriguez, who had volunteered for the most dangerous attack run despite initial opposition to Henderson's unauthorized tactics, received the Distinguished Flying Cross and the assignment to test pilot duties, where he would help develop next-generation attack aircraft designed specifically for low-level maritime operations. Henderson returned to Nebraska after the war, married his high school sweetheart, Mary Ellen Thompson, and opened a small aircraft repair business at the Omaha Municipal Airport. Veterans Administration records show that he rarely spoke publicly about his military service, declining numerous requests for interviews from military historians and aviation magazines. His repair shop became a gathering place for local pilots, where Henderson quietly shared his knowledge of aircraft modification and maintenance with a new generation of aviators. Mary Ellen later recalled that her husband spent many evenings in his workshop designing improvements to civilian aircraft using the same innovative approach that had served him during the war. He never called himself a hero, she explained to their grandchildren years later. He just said he did what needed to be done, same as fixing a broken harvester back on the farm. Letters and testimonies from the airmen who had survived because of Henderson's tactics continued to arrive at his Nebraska address for decades after the war ended. Lieutenant Johnson wrote from his home in Oklahoma, "Bill, I've been thinking about that day over the Bismarck Sea, and I want you to know that I still can't believe we all made it home. You saved not just our lives that day, but the lives of thousands of American boys who didn't have to assault those Japanese positions because the supplies never arrived." Chen, who had become a commercial airline pilot and aviation safety consultant, wrote, "Your willingness to break the rules when the rules weren't working taught me more about leadership than any textbook or training manual. Every time I make a difficult decision, I think about that morning when you chose results over regulations." The transformation in military doctrine that resulted from Henderson's disobedience extended far beyond the immediate tactical innovations his squadron had developed. The Army Air Forces established a formal program for evaluating tactical suggestions from combat crews, recognizing that innovation often emerged from operational necessity rather than theoretical planning. Flight training curricula were revised to emphasize adaptive thinking and tactical flexibility rather than rigid adherence to established procedures. Most importantly, The success of Henderson's unauthorized modifications led to the development of specialized attack aircraft that incorporated his innovations from the design phase, rather than requiring field-expedient modifications to existing bombers. The mathematical legacy of Henderson's decision can be measured in the shipping tonnage that Japanese forces were unable to deliver to their scattered garrisons throughout the Pacific. Conservative estimates suggest that the tactical innovations developed by Henderson's squadron contributed to the destruction of over 2 million tons of enemy shipping, including fuel tankers, ammunition vessels, and troop transports that would have sustained Japanese resistance for months longer than ultimately occurred. The psychological impact on enemy naval operations was equally significant. Japanese convoy commanders became increasingly reluctant to operate during daylight hours, forcing them to adopt routing patterns that significantly reduced the efficiency of their supply operations. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that Henderson's attack had become a case study in Japanese naval training programs, where enemy officers studied American low-level tactics in order to develop countermeasures that diverted resources from offensive operations to defensive preparations. The doctrinal changes that emerged from Henderson's innovations influenced not only World War II operations, but also post-war military aviation development, as aircraft designers began incorporating lessons learned from his unauthorized modifications into next-generation attack aircraft. The tactical principles Henderson had discovered through disobedience and innovation became foundational elements of close air support doctrine, maritime attack profiles, and aircraft armament configuration that remained relevant through the Korean War, Vietnam conflict, and beyond. His decision to prioritize mission effectiveness over regulatory compliance had demonstrated that sometimes the greatest service to military discipline required breaking the rules that prevented success. The scale of the transformation was unprecedented. One man's refusal to accept inadequate results had reshaped an entire branch of military aviation and shortened a world war by eliminating enemy capabilities that would have cost countless American lives to overcome through conventional means. This single act proved the battle was winnable through innovation rather than attrition, through thinking beyond established limitations rather than accepting predetermined outcomes. Henderson's story reveals a fundamental truth about courage that extends far beyond military aviation. Sometimes the most important act of service requires disobeying the orders that prevent excellence in favor of pursuing the results that achieve victory. His willingness to risk court-martial in order to save American lives demonstrated that moral courage often conflicts with bureaucratic compliance, and that leaders must sometimes choose between following rules and achieving missions. The mathematical certainty of poor results from conventional tactics forced Henderson to make a choice between personal safety and operational effectiveness, between career preservation and tactical innovation. His decision to pursue unknown risks rather than accept known failure created a legacy that influenced military doctrine for generations, while validating the principle that innovation emerges from the courage to challenge established limitations. The men who followed Henderson into that unauthorized low-level attack demonstrated their own form of courage by trusting their squadron leader's judgment over headquarters' operational plan, risking their lives on the tactical instincts of a farm mechanic from Nebraska who had refused to accept that destroying enemy shipping was impossible with available resources. The transformation that resulted from their collective disobedience proved that extraordinary results require extraordinary methods, and that sometimes the only way to win is to break the rules that guarantee mediocrity. Henderson never called himself a hero, but thousands of American servicemen lived to see their families again because one pilot refused to follow orders that would have produced minimal results while enemy supplies continued to flow unimpeded to Japanese garrisons throughout the Pacific. His legacy reminds us that courage is not simply following instructions, but rather the willingness to accept responsibility for pursuing victory, even when regulations suggest that failure is acceptable. The ultimate irony of Henderson's story lies in the fact that his act of disobedience became the foundation for new regulations that codified his innovations into official doctrine. The tactical techniques he developed through unauthorized experimentation were eventually incorporated into training manuals, standard operating procedures, and aircraft design specifications that influenced military aviation for decades. His willingness to break rules that prevented success led to better rules that enabled success, demonstrating that progress often requires individuals courageous enough to challenge established limitations in pursuit of superior results. The mathematical precision of his tactical analysis, the innovative spirit that drove his aircraft modifications, and the moral courage that enabled his disobedience combined to create a transformation that exceeded the sum of its individual components. Henderson's decision to prioritize mission accomplishment over regulatory compliance saved lives, shortened the war, and established tactical principles that continued to protect American forces long after his own service ended. His story proves that sometimes the greatest act of military discipline is the willingness to disobey orders that guarantee failure in favor of pursuing methods that achieve victory. Would you have broken the order that morning over the Bismarck Sea, knowing that success might cost your career while failure might cost thousands of American lives? Would you have chosen the unknown risks of innovation over the documented inadequacy of conventional tactics? Henderson's legacy challenges us to consider whether we have the courage to pursue excellence even when regulations suggest that mediocrity is sufficient, and whether we possess the moral strength to accept responsibility for achieving results rather than simply following procedures. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means when victory requires breaking the rules that prevent success.